All right, good evening, everybody. I am uh, hoping that everybody is doing all right on this weekend. So, for those of you that are wondering, I am recording this on a Saturday night from my house. I know last week or 2 weeks ago I recorded from my house, and I had a lot of disruptions from my children, but I can tell you right now that there will be no disruptions this week because I have just put the children down to bed. So there'll be no concerns. The reason I'm recording this on a Saturday night is I have a student who, one of you watching this video, does need to, did request to have this video recorded early, and most of the time, if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not able to sort of accommodate that because I have to spend time with my family on the weekends, and Monday through Friday is very, very hectic. But this time, my wife is actually out volunteering um, at a concert here in town, and so I have, I guess, the house to myself with the kids and put them to bed. So I figured I'd go ahead and get the video done for y'all. All right, so welcome to week 7. We just finished the test, or we are in the process of finishing the test. That will be due, depending on when you watch this, either tomorrow night or last Sunday, depending on when you are watching this video. So, yeah, so we're going to discuss Chapter 6, Behaviorism and Social Cognitive Theory this week. And it's a pretty interesting discussion. So behaviorism is a very, very interesting study, and really it starts off with Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov is sort of one of those names that has transcended even psychology or behaviorism today. It is one of those names that you might hear at a dinner party or sort of any general function because of sort of the interesting nature of his experiments, right? And so Pavlov was a physiologist from Russia, and he developed an experiment where he sort of inadvertently realized that he was turning a an unconditioned stimuli or a conditioned stimuli into an unconditioned stimuli, right? So the researchers would come in with the meat powder, and the dogs would get really excited about the opportunity to eat food, and so they would start to salivate. And over time, they realized that the researchers realized that the dogs were beginning to were beginning to start salivating at the whenever whenever a light would go on or a bell would be rung. This now conditioned stimuli would take place. And the dogs would get excited about it, and they would salivate, and so they now have a conditioned response, which was the salivation whenever the bell was rang. So one of the interesting parts about this study was just it's one of the very first times that we have sort of a record of a unconditioned stimulus turning into a conditioned stimulus and resulting in a conditioned response, right? And so it's a very, very interesting study. If you ever want to read, Pavlov is a very, very interesting guy. He was in Russia around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, and he was very, very dedicated to his work. And so there's some interesting stories about how the way that he found out that the Russian Revolution was taking place was that nobody showed up to work, right? And he was angry because nobody was at work, and so eventually he figured out that nobody came to work because there were bigger things going on at the time. So very interesting guy, interesting study, and there is some use for behaviorism in your class. Obviously, there's tons of use for behaviorism in your class, and really, the one overarching thing that you'll hear time and time again over the next, I guess, 8 weeks of class or so, is you want to make sure you are creating an environment that is warm and caring. These two traits of a classroom have been strongly linked to motivation and achievement. And then you want to provide some kind of emotional security, right? So whenever we are feeling more secure emotionally, we tend to do better, right? And then you really want to be sure that you are, that respect is being shown in your classroom, not just between you and the students, but also each student to another student. So respect is very huge. And if any of you ever work in a high school, I know quite a few of you do. And if any of you ever have the very, very good fortune to be in a high school, I loved working in high schools. I really love working in high schools. But one of the interesting parts is you'll hear students say quite often, and they'll refer to respect, right? So whenever I was in, I don't know that I've been in a high school. I don't know that I've been in a high school that this hasn't been brought up at least a few times. I've been in high schools that are in inner city, mostly Hispanic populations, inner city, mostly black populations. I've been in sort of suburban white populations, and it sort of transcends any respect is one of those things that everybody wants to have, right? And it turns into a lot of trouble for certain teachers whenever they sort of get caught in that trap of, well, they're not respecting me, so I don't have to respect them, right? So that being the student talking. So it is interesting, and it's important just to create a space in your classroom where students are going to want to be, and they will feel safe and they will feel supported. That's the biggest and most important part there. Okay. Operant conditioning is essentially we all operate in our world and in our own environment, and the way that we do that is we exhibit certain behaviors, right? So I cannot control my wife's behavior, and I know that, I very well know that, but what I can do is I can control my own behavior. So one of the things that I discuss with students quite often whenever I was working, especially in the high schools, is having that understanding that you cannot change your mom's behavior, you cannot change your dad's behavior, you cannot change your boyfriend's behavior, your girlfriend's behavior, whatever it might be. But what you can do is you can change your own behavior, right? And so what that does is we can work in a way where we change our own behavior to, I can change my behavior to sort of work in a way to get toward where my wife will exhibit the behaviors that I want her to exhibit, right? So there are a lot of it's a kind of a minefield of a topic with that one, sort of adjusting your wife's behaviors, but ultimately, to give you a sort of a better example, more real life example, whenever I was working in the high schools, I would have students come in and they would just hate teacher X, right? And they would just say, I just can't stand this teacher. I walk in and I immediately fight this student, and I immediately fight this teacher. Obviously not fist fight, but just you'd sort of feel the tension in the air, and I just don't like this teacher. And we would have a discussion about, coming from the teacher's perspective, do you think they enjoy having a student walk in their room and the atmosphere immediately become tense, right? And so then I would ask, can we control how Mr. or Mrs. X, behaves? No, we cannot. But what we can do is we can control our behavior. So, and I would get them to explicitly discuss what it looks like for them to walk in their room. right? So a student A walks into teacher X's room and will kind of just be disruptive. They will kind of knock chairs around. They might be a little more maybe a little more loud. They might cuss a little bit more. Drop a few F-bombs, whatever it might be, and then it's like, well, immediately the teacher's on me. The teacher's on me. And say, well, maybe the teacher doesn't enjoy having that kind of those kinds of behaviors exhibited in her classroom. So I would try and get them to work on walking in the classroom in a way that is more productive, that is more accommodating to a classroom environment. And so it is interesting how much we can make sort of headway with a lot of students by just explaining to them and explicitly explaining that it is going to be a whole lot easier to get teacher X to, I guess, get off your back, or to sort of show you the respect that you want if you break the cycle, right? You as a student, or honestly maybe you as a teacher, has to be the one to break that cycle, and it's going to be difficult, but also obviously very important. Reinforcement. So obviously in the schools today, positive reinforcement is widely discussed, right? So reinforcement ultimately is anything that increases behavior, right? And then punishment is anything that decreases behavior. So positive reinforcement would simply be, I am adding something to the mix to increase the behavior, a desired behavior, right? So I want to see my son pick up his toys more often, and it's a very poignant example because I'm looking around the living room and they're not picked up. So I want my son to pick up his toys more often. So I'm going to try and reinforce the behavior of him picking up his toys, right? So some people look at this and call it bribery, but ultimately what it does is it gives him some kind of motivator to do something that he might not necessarily want to do. In the classroom, we have several reinforcement systems set up, right? So the sheer fact of the simple area of grades is a reinforcement system in a sense, because we have students that exhibit a behavior that is studying, working on their homework, diligently doing a project, whatever it might be, and they will work on this, and then the result will be an A. And then you might get a little bit of help from home, where mom and dad say, well, for every A you get $5, $10. I remember I guess looking back on it now, I sort of remember the friends of mine that parents were a little more, really wanted them to get that A because maybe they weren't earning as many A's as they would like to, so they were getting $20 for an A, $30 for an A. My parents are always too cheap to be willing to give me. Really, I got like $1 for an A, if I remember correctly. And so, anyways, there are two types of reinforcers. There's primary reinforcers and there's secondary reinforcers. Primary: sleep, air, food, sex. These things that we cannot live without, right? They're beneficial for our biology, right? So you cannot not sleep. You need sleep or also die. Same with air, food, water, and there is obviously a lot of debate on whether or not you can survive without sex. I imagine that it is physically possible, but maybe it's one of those where the human race cannot survive without sex. But ultimately, then you have secondary reinforcers that are reinforcers that we have paired with a primary reinforcer, right? So I am currently working, right? And the reason that I work is because I like to have, I like it when people put money in my bank account. Obviously, I enjoy what we do. I enjoy doing this act right now. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, if we did not, if we were to go to work and people stopped putting money in our bank accounts, we would stop going to work, right? So we go to work to get a paycheck, and then that paycheck is then used to go to the grocery store and buy groceries, right? Or it is used to put a roof over our head, or whatever it might be. So, secondary reinforcers are just reinforcers that you can live without them, right? You can live without money, theoretically, but ultimately, you will not die if you don't have money. But money is now so strongly associated with everything else we want in this world that we go to work to make sure we have it. Some of us go to work much more than others to make sure we have it. So anytime that somebody refers to positive reinforcement, it is, again, the increase of a behavior, and positive reinforcement is me giving somebody something to increase a desired behavior, and negative reinforcement is me withdrawing a sort of an aversive in order to increase the behavior, right? So if I am home and I really want my son to do a certain behavior, then I might bother him a lot. I might make the request, and my request will be so annoying to him at a certain point that he'll just do it, and then I'll shut up. Ideally, so yeah. And then reinforcement schedules. The first one is continuous, and essentially this is a reinforcement schedule that is on a fixed schedule, right? So if you think of sort of those classic examples of behaviorism, where you had sort of the pigeon in the cage that would like peck at a little lever to get food. Every time the pigeon pecked, it would drop a pellet of food every single time. There'd be a continuous a reinforcement schedule. If you were to put yourself on a schedule where you can have like one piece of chocolate at night, given that you exhibit a certain behavior, or your child can have a piece of chocolate at night given they exhibit a certain behavior, and it is every single night at like 8 o'clock, and that is a continuous reinforcement schedule, because it is happening every single time that behavior is exhibited. And then you have a fixed ratio, where you have a sort of a ratio of 10 to 1 is a fairly common one. So you know that after exhibiting this behavior 10 times, so let's say you start off with a continuous where you're getting the reinforcer every single time. You'll move to a fixed ratio where you get it every 3 times, every 4 times, every 5 times, depending on what your behavior schedule is, and that is essentially a fixed ratio. So the pigeon pecks the lever 1, 2, 3, food pellet comes out. 1, 2, 3, pellet comes out. Then variable ratio is so it's still on the ratio of 4 to 1, 5 to 1, whatever it might be, 10 to 1. but it is variable. So the pigeon might peck, twice, 1, 2, food pellet comes out. The next time they peck, they realize, okay, well not, and they start pecking, and it takes them 7 times to peck, right? So then they have done it twice, and they have sort of an average of 4.5. So between the 2 sessions, there was a session where the pigeon had to peck 7 times, then another session where the pigeon had to peck twice, and so about 4.5 every 4.5 times they were able to get a pellet of food. So that is a variable ratio, and it's important to consider that slot machines are one of the most widely used examples of variable ratio reinforcement schedules, because this variable ratio reinforcement schedules are the easiest or are the quickest one that can get you to exhibiting a behavior and exhibiting it on a more common time frame. So then a fixed interval is actually, that would be the example I gave earlier, would be a fixed interval where every, me and my wife, we like to eat out. We love to eat out, but we try to break ourselves of that habit of eating out. And so now we, as long as we do not eat out Friday through Wednesday, so essentially yesterday, because today I'm recording this on Saturday, so yesterday was Friday, so we were already bad, so we won't, anyways, so ideally we would not eat out between yesterday and this upcoming Wednesday, and then on Thursday we'd go out to eat. And that'd be a fixed interval, and then a variable interval would be we try to eat out once a week. So we will eat out on Monday, and then we will, that is the beginning of the week, so we will not eat out the rest of the week, and so then we will eat out, then the next week starts and we don't want to eat out on Monday, so then we go, and we will eat out on, let's say, Friday of that next week, and then that week ends, we might go out to eat on Tuesday, so we have eaten out twice in a 7-day period, but we're still sort of sticking to this time frame of once a week. So it's important to understand that within behaviorism, or within sort of behavior plans that you will establish in the schools, you will regularly change, or you will shift the reinforcement schedule depending on how well the student is doing, and how frequent they're exhibiting a certain behavior, right? So if it is a behavior that I want to see a bunch, then we will put it on a continuous schedule where we're just reinforcing it as much as possible. And then if it is, then once they start exhibiting that behavior, we might put them on a more fixed ratio schedule where it is every 3 times they're getting this reinforcer, and then over time you go to every 4 times, every 5 times, every 6 times, and then you can go to at some point a variable ratio schedule where they will get it every 4 times, but on a different sort of on a different number every time. So it really just depends on how well the behavior is going and how well the student is doing. So punishment is really where there's a lot of sort of controversy, or I guess debate in the schools these days. This is where I want our discussion for this week. So what I want to discuss is there any room for punishment in the schools? Right. So we, even when I was growing up, there was if you did a certain behavior, then you were going to be punished, right? So they had paddling at the school they had spanking at the school that I went to, and so if you exhibited a behavior that was bad enough, you could be paddled. Now, if you are an opponent to punishment, explain why, and obviously this is ideally as safe of a space as possible, but just explain what your concerns are whenever it comes to punishment. For me, one of the reasons that I have such a tough time with punishment in the schools is because it is not always delivered fairly, right? So it is not always delivered in a way that is objective, and oftentimes in the schools we are fairly subjective about how we are sort of executing a punishment. So it is important that we consider all these different variables, all these different factors whenever we are working in the schools. And if we are going to incorporate some kind of punishment into the schools, what will that look like? What would the punishment look like? What do certain behaviors deserve? And how do you make sure that the behaviors are consistently punished in a certain way, right? So one of the big concerns in the schools today is the suspension rate of black students, right? And it's crazy to think about. We used to live 20, 30 years ago, and honestly, it's probably not even 20, 30 years ago in certain parts of this country, or maybe even certain parts of this region, but there was a lot of belief that, well, yeah, they were getting suspended because they're bad kids. They're worse than the rest of the group. Thankfully, we know better than that now, but there is still a lot of work to try and figure out why we are suspending students that are students of color at a higher rate than we are our white students, and what do we do about that? And one of the responses has been positive behavior intervention supports, PBIS, where we can be more objective. And one of the ways that we are being more objective within PBIS is by initiating making procedures very standardized and very objective, and having essentially a matrix for how to punish students objectively. So these are all things to discuss. What are your views on it? Or if you are completely anti-punishment, fantastic, not a problem. If you are if you think this whole positive behavior, positive reinforcement stuff is bogus, go ahead and let us know. Tell us why you believe what you believe, and so we'll move from there. All right. So one of the big things you need to understand whenever you're looking at behavior plans is that you have to understand the function of a behavior, right? So it is important that we understand which one of the four functions it is. So is it access to tangibles? So essentially they are a student is trying to get access to something, right? So you'll oftentimes see students that have like severe autism will work for like iPad time, or I mean honestly, not even students with autism. They're children are working for YouTube Kids, or they are working for some kind of thing, right? So that is access to tangibles. Then attention is just simply that attention. I'm giving you attention. And then escape is I am trying to get out of this situation. I hate math. I am no good at math. I personally, as Jason Lloyd, I love math. But if I were a student in schools and I hated math, then I might cuss out my teacher or throw my book across the room, because I know that can easily get me out of this room and get me out of math. Or if I hate reading, and I know that Thursday is the day that we do popcorn reading in my English class, and the teacher will eventually call on me to read a passage, I might do something I might ask to use the restroom, or I might see if the band director needs extra help moving chairs around during fourth period, because I don't want to be in the English classroom that day. And then access to sensory. where this is one you see with students with autism quite a bit, where they are exhibiting a certain kind of behavior, a self-stimming behavior, because it does give them some kind of sensory response. So, and the reason that it's important to consider the function of a behavior is because two students can show the same topography of a behavior, and that behavior can look the exact same, but that does not necessarily mean that they're exhibiting it for the same reason, right? So here I give the example of, so John and Jamie have both been kicked out of the classroom for inappropriate language, cussing, crude humor, whatever it might be. So it looks the same. So both John and Jamie are both exhibiting the same behavior. As you sort of dig a little bit deeper, you realize that John is only showing the behavior in math. So, this would lend you to believe that John is really not a fan of math, and so is probably trying to do whatever he can to get out of math. Whereas Jamie is doing these behaviors on a more seemingly random schedule, right? So the reason that this matters is because it'll depend on depending on the function of the behavior, you either change your antecedent or your consequence. And right here, you'll see the ABCs, your antecedent, and then B, I'll lose my pointer. B is your behavior, so the cussing, and then C is your consequence. So what is the end result, right? So essentially what this comes down to is it is hypothesized currently that John is trying to escape from his math class. So you'll probably change the antecedent of the behavior, where you will you will sort of you could change the demand of that certain behavior. So he hates he hates being in math class because he is not very good at math. So you might give him an opportunity to do math in a different place. You might give him an opportunity to sort of work quietly, or change the demand. If you are a teacher that calls in your students quite often, you will work with that student to sort of change the demands that are being placed on that student. If you are, if he is willing to do the math, but he struggles to stay on task for a long time, you can put him on a behavior schedule that will he'll do a couple math problems, and then you will let him out of the classroom for a few minutes, or do whatever you need to do for a few minutes. So that's actually changing the consequence of his behaviors, but it's also changing the antecedent. But he's just changing his behavior, which then does change his consequence. Jamie is possibly attention seeking, right? So Jamie is one that he is cussing, and you have to look and see what is happening in Jamie's environment that is leading him to exhibit that behavior, right? So are students giggling? Is the teacher reinforcing that behavior inadvertently by calling them and saying, Jamie, cut it out, whatever it might be. So just understanding that you have to look at what the antecedent is of the behavior, and also what the consequence of the behavior is, and that'll help you sort of narrow down where what the function of the behavior is. Okay. So this is just a competing pathways chart. It is pretty useful if you are ever in a situation where you are struggling to understand what is going on with your student. So I usually just ignore that. Probably shouldn't, but I usually don't focus so much on the setting event. But antecedent is just what is happening directly before the problem behavior. and then what consequences is taking place, right? So then that produces your function, that sort of reveals your function. So what you want is to get the student to the point where where he or she is exhibiting the desired behavior, and you are giving them some kind of consequence that a new consequence. But oftentimes, what is done, what you see happening in the schools, is we get the student to exhibit an alternate behavior, and by exhibiting that alternate behavior, they will get they will be able to sort of access the function of the behavior, right? So if my behavior is attention seeking, then I will do my best to ensure that Johnny gets all the attention he can get for doing something appropriate, right? So I really want him to do his math homework, but he wants to come in, or I guess Jamie from the last example. So Jamie is coming in and he doesn't want to do the math homework. He just wants to goof off with his friends. Then I will do my best to give him some kind of the attention that he is wanting while he's doing his math homework, as opposed to giving him sort of the free reign of, he's not getting any attention at all, and then he is more likely to exhibit the concerning behaviors. So when it gets tough, this is an example of a situation that I was having to deal with in class. So this was a freshman a few years ago that I worked with in Denver. He was really, really having a tough time in his math class. He absolutely hated his math teacher. We initially considered changing the antecedent, which at the time was the math class, but there was, administration was not okay with the idea of him getting out of this particular math class. And the student really, really stuck by his guns whenever he would claim that the teacher hated him and that the teacher was lying on him and that the teacher was essentially fabricating stories that would get this student in trouble, right? And so the student would regularly skip class, and he knew he was skipping class, but he would really double down on his lies and say that he would go to class, but he was getting kicked out of class because the teacher hated him so much. And so what we ended up doing was we ended up putting him on a differential reinforcement schedule, where what we did was I gave him what we had called a blue slip. And blue slip, every school has had them. It is essentially a slip of paper where the student takes it to each teacher and gets assigned. And they get assigned at the end of the period, and once they have sort of done what they need to do to be successful in the class, they get assigned, and they go off to their next period. And initially he hated that idea, but I essentially framed it from a perspective of, listen, you say that Mr. Such and Such is lying about you, that he is this awful teacher. Well, this is a way for us to prove that he is lying against you. He is lying about you, and he is making up these stories. Well, really what happened was he was going to class, his grades were going up, he, and once he had to exhibit some positive behaviors to get that slip signed, then his relationship with the teacher got better, and we had to get him to want to get that slip signed. So the way that we encouraged him to be willing to get that slip signed is by getting his mom to agree that she would go and buy him a soccer ball. So really, just whenever you're in the schools, you get creative. You figure out what you got to do to get your students taken care of, and it might not necessarily look like might not look the prettiest. It might not be something that everybody loves. I remember whenever I sort of made this plan for the student, a few of the administrators in the school absolutely hated it, thought it would be ridiculous that we were rewarding a student for going to class. But ultimately, what we were rewarding was the student going to class and exhibiting behaviors that were showing that he can be successful in the school. 'Cause by the end of the year, his grade, he did fail math, unfortunately, because his grade was so low, but his grade went from, a 2% to a 50%. So overall, a huge improvement, right? So, then we have social cognitive theory, where we essentially we change our behaviors as we observe others. So, cognitive dissonance is a big sort of a big component within this, and so I can't help but think about sort of the political landscape and how we are constantly exposed to all these different political ideologues, whether it is on the left or whether it is on the right, and that is leading us to essentially change our behaviors in response to that individual, right? So we watch TV and we see politician A come on the screen, and we absolutely we consider ourselves a centrist, but this politician comes up and he or she is on the side that I cannot go with, and so I will start to change my behaviors in a way that distances myself from that individual. So an interesting theory that can sort of go hand in hand with this is social comparison theory from Festinger, where they actually one of the things they discuss is this constant sort of appraisal system that we have, this unconscious appraisal system that we have, where we will be watching others, and essentially if I go outside and I see an individual, so the house that I used to live in Sacramento, I had a neighbor 2 doors down that they were very nice people, but they would regularly smoke pot in their front yard. They would have a lot of parties in their house in the front yard. You'd wake up on Sunday morning and take your kid for a walk, and you'd have to like pick up beer. You'd have to like move beer bottles out of the off the sidewalk, because they just did not pick up after themselves, and they were doing a lot of things that were very annoying, to be honest. And so, whenever that happens, and obviously that's a very extreme example. You can think of examples from all kinds of walks of life, but whenever this happens, we make this unconscious appraisal and determine if we are, at some point we might need to have a social interaction with this individual, and we determine if we are, if there is, sort of a significant difference between me and them. There's too much of a distance to cover for us to really be friends, or for us to really be in regular social interaction, and so we will not. So I will avoid that situation. Or if we come across an individual that is that we see as sort of socially similar to ourselves, maybe there is a little bit of a distance, but we're relatively similar, then we might change our own behaviors to match the behaviors of the individual that we're around, right? So the example of my neighbor who smokes pot and drinks all the beer and throws it all over the yard, I will change my behaviors to veer as far away from their behaviors as possible. Whereas a friend of mine that I had a friend who he loved his bike. He loved bikes, and I really enjoyed bikes quite a bit. He was a much hard, he did every bike. He rode bike, mountain bike, everything. He loved doing that. He just loved being on his bike, and I'm not a huge fan of throwing myself down hills. So I don't mountain bike. But it was he was seen as an individual that I wanted to be around, and this was an easy way for me to be around him. So I would increase my rate of mountain biking, which was a very short-lived short-lived experiment on my part. So vicarious learning. So vicarious learning is something that we've already talked about. So when we see somebody pulled over by a cop for speeding, we slow down. That is vicarious learning. We are learning from others' actions. And self-regulation is really, really critical. It's a huge, very, very critical behavior in the schools. Obviously, we need to do as much as we can to teach students how to regulate themselves, because self-regulation can be a very, very important task, and it can also be a very, very difficult one because we have these devices so readily available to us these days. So and self-regulation and self-talk, two very, very effective strategies, two very effective interventions for our students that can help them better regulate themselves. And there are some criticisms of social cognitive theory, but ultimately there are a lot of important contributions of the work that has been done within SCT. And so that is it for this week. We're sitting at 46 minutes right now, so I am pretty well on track for my 45-minute mark that I always try to keep at. If any of you have any questions, any complaints, please email me. Let me know. Like I said, I'm recording from the house again this week, but as you noticed, no babies. So hopefully things are a little bit smoother this time. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a great rest of your weekend and have a great week. And do not forget the discussion post that we discussed a little bit earlier. And yeah, so all right. Thanks, everybody.